Do you even understand English, or do you just memorize the menu and smile? The words landed lightly, almost playful, but sharp enough to slice through the quiet hum of the restaurant. A few soft chuckles followed, the kind people try to hide behind napkins and wine glasses, but never quite succeed. Crystal clinked somewhere in the distance, a low murmur of conversation faltered, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to tilt toward the table where William Carter sat, fingers resting casually against the rim of a half-finished glass of red wine, his tailored suit catching the warm glow of the chandelier above. Across from him stood Amora Johnson, her black apron pressed neatly against her uniform, a leather order book tucked gently against her side, her posture straight but not stiff, her presence quiet but unmistakably steady. She didn't flinch. Not when the laughter rippled. Not when the man across from her leaned back in his chair, studying her as if she were a curiosity rather than a person. Instead, her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the tray she carried, the only sign that the moment had weight. The scent of seared steak and butter drifted through the air, mingling with the faint citrus of polished wood and the distant hum of jazz playing just loud enough to be felt but not heard. "Would you like your steak medium rare, sir?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled, unmistakably clear. Not defensive. Not rushed. Just precise. The question hung there, simple and professional, yet something about it shifted the air. William's smile faltered for half a second, barely noticeable, but real. He tilted his head, as if recalibrating, as if the script he had expected had just been rewritten without his permission. Around them, a woman at the neighboring table lowered her glass slightly, her eyes flicking between them, curiosity replacing amusement. A server paused mid-step near the bar, sensing the subtle tension threading through the room like an invisible wire. William exhaled softly, a quiet chuckle escaping as he leaned forward again, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "Medium rare," he repeated, then added, his tone still. "Coated in that same effortless superiority, if you got that right." Another ripple of laughter, thinner this time, less certain. Amora gave a small nod, jotting down the order with a pen that moved quickly but deliberately, her handwriting clean, practiced. The overhead lights reflected faintly off the polished marble floor, casting soft shadows beneath her shoes, shadows that didn't waver even as the moment stretched. She turned slightly, ready to step away, to dissolve back into the rhythm of service, but before she could, William spoke again, his voice just loud enough to carry. "Actually," he said, lifting a single finger as if calling back a thought, "tell me, how many languages do you speak?" The question hovered, different now, edged with something sharper than mockery, something closer to a challenge. Amora paused. Not long. Just enough for the room to feel it. Her eyes lifted to meet his for the first time, calm, unreadable, steady in a way that didn't ask for permission. Somewhere behind them, a glass was set down a little too hard, the soft thud echoing more loudly than it should have. The jazz music seemed to slow, or maybe it was just the way time folded in on itself in that moment. William's gaze held hers, confident, expectant, certain he controlled the tempo of the exchange. But there was a shift now, subtle, almost invisible, like the first drop in temperature before a storm. Amora's lips parted slightly, not in hesitation, but in preparation, as if she were choosing not just words, but the exact weight they would carry when they landed. And for the first time since he had spoken, the room didn't feel like it belonged to him anymore. 7, Amora said quietly, her voice neither raised nor softened, simply placed into the air with the same precision she used to set a glass on a table. The word did not echo, yet it carried, threading through the low hum of the restaurant until it reached the edges of every listening ear. William blinked once, the smallest interruption in his composure, his fingers pausing against the stem of his glass before he recovered, leaning back with a faint smile that tried to return the moment to something light. Something dismissible. 7, he repeated, a hint of amusement curling at the edges of his voice, as though the number itself were a joke he had not yet decided how to tell. Amora gave a small nod, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady but not confrontational, as if she were simply confirming an order rather than stepping into a challenge. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone even, unshaken. A man at a nearby table shifted in his seat, the soft scrape of chair legs against the floor cutting briefly through the silence. A woman across the room leaned forward slightly, her hand hovering above her wine glass, forgotten mid-motion. William let out a soft exhale through his nose, the kind that suggested patience rather than disbelief, but the rhythm of it was off, just enough to betray the shift beneath the surface. "All right," he said, lifting his chin slightly, his voice smooth again, practiced, controlled. He switched languages without warning, his words flowing in French, measured and deliberate, the cadence of someone who expected to be followed but not matched. The sentence landed between them like a test placed carefully on a table. Amora did not rush to answer. She listened, her head tilting just slightly, as if adjusting to the tone rather than the meaning. Then she responded, her French fluid, unforced, not rehearsed but lived, each syllable shaped with a natural ease that did not ask for approval. The shift was immediate. A fork paused halfway to someone's mouth. A quiet murmur slipped from the bar. William's smile thinned, not gone, but sharpened, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest recalculation. "Interesting," he said, returning to English for a fraction of a second before pivoting again, this time into Italian, faster now, less measured, as if speed itself might create an advantage. The words came with a subtle edge, a slight misstep hidden within the phrasing, small enough that most would not notice, but present. Amora answered again, her Italian steady, her tone calm, and then, almost gently, she corrected the one misplaced word, not as a challenge, but as a fact. The correction hung there, delicate but undeniable. A soft intake of breath rippled through the nearest tables. William's fingers tightened briefly around his glass before he set it down, the base touching the table with a controlled, quiet click. He did not laugh this time. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his focus narrowing entirely on her, as if the rest of the room had fallen away. He shifted again, this time into German, his voice firmer, more direct, the structure of his sentence clean, intentional, precise. Amora met it without hesitation, her response equally precise, her accent crisp, her delivery unshaken, each word landing exactly where it belonged. The room was no longer murmuring. It was listening. Even the music seemed to fade into the background, reduced to a distant pulse beneath the tension that now filled the space. William's jaw tightened, just slightly, as he leaned back once more, his confidence no longer effortless but held, maintained. He tapped his fingers once against the table, a small, controlled motion, then looked at her again, really looked this time, as if seeing her for the first time beyond the uniform, beyond the role he had assigned her. "Japanese," he said simply, the word itself a challenge now, stripped of humor, stripped of ease. The air shifted again, thinner, sharper. Amora's grip on the tray relaxed, just a fraction, her shoulders lowering in a way that was almost imperceptible, and when she spoke, her Japanese was not just correct, it was soft, respectful, the cadence of it carrying a quiet depth that felt less like performance and more like memory. And in that moment, something in the room changed completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, as if the balance of the space had tilted, and for the first time since the exchange began, William Carter was no longer the one controlling where it would land. The silence that followed did not break all at once, it thinned slowly, like air being pulled from a room no one realized was sealed. A man near the window set his glass down without drinking, the faint tap against the table sounding louder than it should have. Somewhere behind the bar, a server forgot to move, his hand still hovering over a polished plate. As if time had paused just for him. William Carter sat very still, his back straight against the chair, his eyes locked on Amora with a focus that no longer carried amusement, only calculation, only the quiet urgency of someone trying to understand how the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, his jaw tightening just slightly, a flicker of something unfamiliar crossing his expression before he masked it. "Where did you learn that?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the performative edge it had carried before. It was not a challenge this time. It was a question. Amora did not answer immediately. Her fingers adjusted the tray at her side, not nervously, but deliberately, as if anchoring herself to something steady. The overhead lights caught the edge of her cheek, softening the lines of her face, but her eyes remained clear, unwavering. "I learned because I had to," she said, her tone quiet, but not distant, not defensive, just honest in a way that did not ask for sympathy. William's brows drew together slightly, the answer not fitting into whatever expectation he had prepared. Around them, the room leaned in again, but differently now, not waiting for a spectacle, but for something real. Had to, he repeated, his voice softer, almost careful, as if the words themselves might shift if handled too roughly. Amora nodded once, her gaze drifting just past him for a brief second, not away, but through, as if something beyond the walls of the restaurant had come into focus. My mother did not speak English well, she said, and the word settled into the space with a weight that was quiet but undeniable. When she got sick, I was the one who spoke for her. The sentence did not rush. It did not dramatize. It simply existed, and because of that, it changed everything. The clink of silverware resumed somewhere in the distance, hesitant, uncertain, as if the room itself was unsure how to move again. William's hand, which had been resting on the table, shifted slightly, his fingers curling inward as though he had forgotten what to do with them. Hospitals, Amora continued, her voice steady, her eyes returning to his, not accusing, not pleading, just present. Appointments. Calls. Paperwork. People speak fast when they think you do not understand. I learned faster. A faint breath moved through the room, not quite a sigh, not quite a reaction, but something that acknowledged the shift that had taken place. William looked at her differently now, not as someone below him, not as a role, but as a person whose story had entered the space without permission and refused to leave. The lines of his face softened, not dramatically, but enough to be seen. And you speak all of them like that? He asked, his voice quieter still, as if the volume he once owned no longer belonged to him. Amora gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, the movement simple, grounded. Not perfectly, she said. But well enough when it matters. The words hung there, and for a moment, no one moved. Then a woman at the nearby table exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering as if she had been holding tension she did not realize she carried. A man across the room nodded to himself, subtle, thoughtful. The energy had shifted completely now. What had started as entertainment had become something else, something heavier, something that asked more of everyone present. William leaned back slightly, his gaze dropping to the table before returning to her, slower this time, more deliberate. The confidence that once filled his posture was still there, but it had changed shape, less rigid, less certain. He glanced at the empty space in front of him, then back at her again, as if measuring something he could no longer define in simple terms. The power in the room had not disappeared. It had moved. And for the first time in a long time, William Carter was not entirely sure where it now belonged. The air did not return to normal, it rearranged itself, settling into something quieter, something more aware. The soft jazz in the background resumed its place, but it no longer led the room, it followed it. William Carter remained seated, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless, as if each movement now required a fraction more thought than before. His eyes stayed on Amora, not with dominance, not with dismissal, but with a kind of focus that suggested he was seeing details he had overlooked only minutes ago. The faint reflection of the chandelier flickered in his glass, untouched, forgotten. You said you learned because you had to, he said slowly, his voice measured, each word placed carefully, as though he were navigating unfamiliar ground. Most people would have stopped at one language. Maybe two. His gaze lifted again, searching, not accusing, but trying to understand. Why keep going? The question lingered, not sharp, but open, and for a moment, even the quiet conversations that had begun to return around the room softened again, as if the answer mattered beyond just the two of them. Amora shifted her weight slightly, her shoes making the faintest sound against the marble floor, grounding her in the present. She did not look away. Because one language was never enough, she said, her tone even, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that carried memory without needing to describe it. William's brow furrowed slightly, the answer not simple, not something that could be filed away easily. Not enough for what? He asked, and this time, there was no trace of the earlier edge, only a quiet curiosity that seemed almost unfamiliar coming from him. Amora's fingers relaxed around the tray, the tension that had once been there replaced with something steadier, something rooted. Not enough to be heard, she replied. The words landed differently than anything before them, not dramatic, not raised, but undeniable. A soft shift moved through the room, chairs adjusting, breaths held a second longer than usual. William's expression changed again, more subtle this time, but deeper. The confidence he carried had not disappeared, but it no longer stood alone, it was being questioned from within. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his gaze drifting for a brief second to the people around them, as if seeing them not as an audience, but as witnesses. When his eyes returned to Amora, they carried something quieter. "You think I do not listen?" he asked, not defensive, but reflective, as if the question had turned inward before it reached her. Amora did not answer immediately. She watched him, not with judgment, but with a calm patience that did not rush the moment. "I think," she said slowly, "you are used to being understood without having to try." The statement did not accuse. It revealed. A faint murmur passed through a nearby table, quickly stilled, as if even the listeners recognized the truth in it. William's lips parted slightly, then pressed together again, the reaction small, but real. He tapped his fingers once against the table, then stopped, as if the habit no longer fit the moment. "And you are not?" he asked, quieter now, the question carrying less certainty, more reflection. Amora shook her head once, gently. "No, sir," she said. "People hear what they expect to hear, not what is actually said." The room seemed to absorb that, the weight of it settling into the space between conversations, between glances, between thoughts. William looked down at the table again, at the untouched glass, at the polished surface reflecting a version of himself that now felt slightly out of place. When he looked back up, something had shifted again, not dramatically, but undeniably. "So what do you expect people to hear from you?" he asked, his voice steady, but softer than it had ever been. Amora held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her presence now filled the space in a way that did not ask permission. "Only what is true," she said. The simplicity of it left no room for anything else. No performance. No defense. Just truth. And in that moment, as the quiet hum of the restaurant slowly rebuilt itself around them, it became clear that the exchange had moved far beyond a test, beyond a challenge, into something neither of them had planned, something that could not be undone by laughter or dismissed by status. The balance had shifted, and it was not shifting back. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and yet the silence between them felt fuller than any conversation that had come before it, layered with everything that had just been revealed and everything that had not yet been said. The low hum of the restaurant slowly returned, but it no longer erased the moment, it carried it, weaving it into every quiet glance and subtle shift of posture around the room. William Carter sat still, his gaze resting on Amora with a steadiness that no longer sought control, but clarity, as if he were trying to see something that had always been there but had remained just outside his attention. He reached for his glass, then stopped halfway, his fingers hovering before retreating, the motion unfinished, unnecessary. "Truth," he repeated under his breath, not quite a question, not quite a statement, more like a word he was testing for the first time. His eyes lifted again, meeting hers without the earlier distance. "That sounds simple," he said, though his tone suggested he already knew it was not. Amora did not move, her presence calm, anchored, unaffected by the weight of his attention or the quiet awareness of the room around them. "It is simple," she replied, her voice steady, "but it is not easy." The distinction settled between them, and William leaned back slightly, exhaling as if something inside him had shifted out of place and had not yet settled again. He glanced briefly toward the window, where the city lights flickered against the glass, reflections layered over reflections, each one slightly distorted depending on the angle. For a second, his focus drifted there, then returned, slower this time. "I built my life on being understood quickly," he said, his voice quieter now, more measured, as if he were choosing each word with care rather than confidence. "Meetings, negotiations, decisions. If people hesitate, you lose time. If they misunderstand, you lose money." He paused, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, no longer tapping, no longer restless. There is no space for explanation. The word seemed unfamiliar in his mouth. Amora listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, allowing the space to hold what he was saying without pushing or pulling it in any direction. "That works," she said after a moment, "when everyone speaks the same language." William let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet laugh, but without humor. "And when they do not?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the answer. Amora's eyes softened slightly, not with pity, but with recognition. "Then the person with power decides what is heard," she said. The statement was not accusatory. It was observational. And because of that, it landed deeper. A subtle shift moved through the room again, not loud, not obvious, but present in the way people held themselves, in the way conversation slowed just enough to listen without appearing to. William's shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension he carried no longer invisible, but acknowledged, even if only to himself. "And tonight," he said, his voice barely above the hum of the room, "that was me." It was not framed as a defense. It was not softened. It was simply said. Amora gave a small nod, not affirming, not correcting, just accepting the statement as it was. The weight of it remained in the air, but it did not crush the moment, it clarified it. William looked down at his hands again, then back up, his expression no longer guarded, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. "I thought I was testing you," he admitted, his voice steady, though quieter than before. "But I was not listening." The word settled into the space between them, and for the first time since the exchange began, there was no tension in the room, only a quiet stillness that felt earned rather than forced. Amora adjusted the tray in her hands, the motion small, grounding, bringing the moment back into the present. "Listening takes time," she said, her tone unchanged, calm, measured. "Most people do not think it is worth it." William held her gaze, something shifting again, deeper this time, not outward, but inward, as if the realization had finally reached a place it could not be ignored. "I am starting to think it is," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything he had said before. The restaurant moved around them again, the rhythm returning, but altered, as if the space itself had been recalibrated by something unseen. And as Amora stood there, composed, unshaken, it was clear that what had begun as a moment of dismissal had become something else entirely, something that neither wealth nor status could control, only recognize. The words did not fade when they were spoken, they lingered, settling into the space between them like something that could not be taken back or ignored. William Carter sat with his hands resting loosely on the table now, no longer tapping, no longer reaching for the glass he had forgotten existed, his posture still composed but undeniably changed, as if the structure of it had softened from the inside out. Around them, the restaurant had resumed its rhythm, but it moved differently, quieter, more aware, as though everyone present had felt the shift and chosen, consciously or not, to move with it. A server passed by with a tray of drinks, slowing just slightly as they approached, then continuing on, careful not to interrupt the moment that still held the center of the room without needing to announce itself. William drew in a slow breath, his gaze lifting once more to Amora, not searching this time, not testing, but steady in a way that suggested he had arrived somewhere he had not expected to be. "You said something earlier," he began, his voice calm, measured, each word deliberate, about people hearing what they expect. He paused, the faintest crease forming between his brows, not from confusion, but from recognition. "I think I have spent most of my life expecting to be right." The admission did not carry pride. It carried weight. Amora listened, her expression unchanged, but her attention fully present, allowing the words to exist without rushing to respond. William leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting for a moment toward the far end of the dining room where a couple sat quietly, their conversation low, their gestures soft, then back again, as if grounding himself in something real before continuing. "It works," he said, his voice quieter now, "when you are surrounded by people who agree with you, or need something from you." His fingers moved once, lightly brushing the edge of the table, not restless, just aware. "But it does not leave much room for being wrong." The last two words landed more heavily than the rest. A faint clink of silverware sounded from across the room, then faded again, swallowed by the stillness that followed. Amora shifted the tray slightly in her hands, the motion small but intentional, as if marking the transition from one moment to the next. Being wrong is not the problem, she said, her voice steady, her tone calm. Not wanting to see it is. The distinction settled into the air, and William's eyes held hers, not defensively, not challengingly, but with a quiet intensity that suggested the words had reached somewhere deeper than he had anticipated. He nodded once, slowly, the movement almost imperceptible, but real. And tonight, he said, his voice softer than before, I did not want to see it. The admission was simple, but it carried more than any apology could have at that moment. It was not polished. It was not strategic. It was honest. A subtle shift moved through the room again, not in sound, but in presence, as if something had been acknowledged that could not be undone. William exhaled, his shoulders lowering slightly, the tension that had once defined his posture now replaced by something quieter, something more grounded. He glanced at the menu briefly, then closed it, setting it aside with a soft, deliberate motion, as though the original purpose of his visit had become secondary to something else entirely. I have meetings tomorrow, he continued, his tone thoughtful, reflective rather than declarative. People from 3 different countries. We will sit in a room, speak in one language, and assume we all understand each other. He let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet, self-aware smile. Now I am not so sure that we do. Amora's gaze softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with recognition, as if the realization he was arriving at was one she had seen many times before, just from a different side of the table. Understanding takes more than words, she said. It takes attention. William repeated the word silently, his lips moving just enough to form it without sound. Attention. It seemed to settle into him differently than the others, as if it carried a meaning he had overlooked for years. He looked at her again, really looked, not at the uniform, not at the role, but at the person standing in front of him. Steady, composed, unshaken by the power that had once defined the space. And you pay attention to everyone, he asked, not as a test, but as a genuine question, the kind that does not expect a perfect answer. Amora considered it for a moment, her eyes thoughtful, then shook her head gently. No, she said. Just the ones who need to be heard. The words landed with quiet precision, and William let out a slow breath, something in his expression easing, not because the answer was simple, but because it was clear. He nodded once more, this time without hesitation, without calculation. Then I think, he said, his voice steady, grounded in a way it had not been before, I needed to be heard tonight. The statement did not elevate him. It did not diminish her. It simply placed him, for the first time, on the same level of truth. And as the soft hum of the restaurant continued around them, it became clear that the conversation had moved beyond correction, beyond challenge, into something quieter, something lasting, something that would follow him long after he left the table. William did not look away after saying it, and for a moment, the weight of his own words seemed to settle into him more deeply than anything Amora could have added. The restaurant continued around them, but the space at their table felt set apart, as if time had slowed just enough to let something real take shape. A server approached quietly, placing a plate down at a nearby table with careful precision, the soft clink of porcelain grounding the room back into motion, but not breaking what had already shifted. William glanced briefly at the movement, then back at Amora, his expression no longer guarded, no longer layered with expectation, but open in a way that suggested he was no longer trying to control how this moment would end. Most people in my world, he said slowly, his voice thoughtful, they speak to impress, to persuade, to win something. He paused, his fingers resting flat against the table, no tension in them now, just presence. You speak to be understood. The difference hung there, simple but undeniable. Amora did not immediately respond, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged. As if she did not need to fill the silence to prove anything further. William gave a faint nod, almost to himself, as though acknowledging something he had only just realized. That is rare, he added, quieter now, the words carrying more weight because they were not spoken for anyone else in the room, only for the truth of them. A woman at a nearby table glanced over again, not with curiosity this time, but with quiet respect, her attention lingering just long enough to be felt before returning to her own conversation. The atmosphere had softened, not into comfort, but into clarity. William reached for his glass again, this time actually lifting it, taking a small sip, as if re-entering the rhythm of the evening, but not the same person who had sat there before. He set the glass down gently, the movement controlled, intentional. "What would you have done," he asked, his voice steady, "if I had not asked that question?" His eyes met hers, not searching for a particular answer, but genuinely wanting to understand the path he had interrupted. Amara considered it for a moment, her gaze shifting slightly as if tracing a version of the evening that no longer existed. "I would have taken your order," she said simply. "And I would have done my job well." The answer was not defensive. It was not diminished. It was complete. William's lips curved slightly, not into a smile of amusement, but into something quieter, something closer to respect. "And I would have left," he said, finishing the thought aloud, more to himself than to her. "Thinking I understood everything I needed to." Amara gave a small nod, the motion gentle, almost unnoticeable, but it confirmed what he already knew. The realization did not land like a shock. It settled, steady and undeniable. William leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more across the room, but this time, he saw it differently, not as a space he occupied, but as a place filled with people whose stories existed beyond what he chose to notice. A man laughing at the bar. A couple sharing a quiet conversation. A young server balancing two plates with careful focus. Details that had always been there, but had not mattered until now. He looked back at Amara, and something in his expression shifted again, not in uncertainty, but in decision. "I have spent years believing that perspective comes from experience," he said, his voice calm, grounded. "But I am starting to think it comes from listening to experiences that are not your own." The words carried a quiet conviction, not loud, not performative, but real. Amara held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was a faint warmth in her eyes now, not approval, not validation, just recognition of a truth being reached. "It does," she said softly. "If you let it." The simplicity of it left no room for anything else. William nodded once more, slower this time, as if marking the moment in a way he would not forget. He glanced at the table again, then back up, his posture straightening slightly, not out of control, but out of clarity. "Then I have a lot to learn," he said. It was not an admission of weakness. It was an acceptance of reality. And for the first time since the evening began, there was no tension left in the space between them, only a quiet understanding that something had shifted permanently, not just in the room, but within him. Amara adjusted the tray in her hands once more, preparing to step away, to return to the flow of the restaurant, but the moment lingered just long enough to make it clear that this exchange, simple as it might have seemed from the outside, had changed more than either of them had expected when it began. Amara did not move right away, even as the rhythm of the restaurant called her back into motion, as if the moment needed one final breath before it could fully release her. The soft glow of the overhead lights reflected along the polished floor, stretching shadows that no longer felt heavy, only present. William Carter watched her, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness that something important was about to pass if he let it. He straightened slightly in his chair, the movement subtle, but intentional, as though aligning himself with a decision he had already made but had not yet spoken. "Amara," he said, her name leaving his mouth carefully, not as a label, but as recognition. She paused, just enough to acknowledge it, her gaze returning to him, calm and steady. It was the first time he had used her name, and the difference did not go unnoticed, not by her, not by the room. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone unchanged, respectful but not diminished, grounded in the same quiet confidence that had carried her through the entire exchange. William exhaled slowly, his eyes holding hers without hesitation, without distance. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they landed with a clarity that carried further than anything he had said all evening. There was no performance in them. No attempt to soften or reshape them. Just truth. A subtle stillness moved through the nearby tables, not because the words were loud, but because they were real. Amara did not react immediately. She did not smile. She did not step back. She simply listened, allowing the words to exist without rushing to define them. William's fingers rested lightly on the table, no tension in them now, no need to assert control over anything in the space. Not just about you, he continued, his voice steady, his tone grounded. About how I see people. About how quickly I decide what they are worth. He paused briefly, the weight of his own admission settling into him as much as it did into the room. That is not something I can afford to ignore anymore. The statement did not sound like a promise made to impress. It sounded like a realization that had already taken hold. Amora's eyes softened just slightly, not with approval, not with forgiveness offered freely, but with acknowledgement that what he was saying mattered because he meant it. Seeing takes time, she said quietly. Most people stop too early. William nodded, the motion slow, deliberate, as if each word she spoke was being placed somewhere inside him where it would remain. I did, he admitted. I stopped before I even started. A faint sound of laughter rose from a distant table, soft and unrelated, reminding the room that life continued beyond this moment, yet it did not diminish what had been built here. William reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the movement smooth but unhurried, and pulled out a simple card, placing it on the table between them. He did not slide it toward her immediately. He left it there, as if giving the gesture space to exist without pressure. If you ever decide, he said, his voice calm, that you want to use what you know somewhere else, somewhere that listens differently, I would like to be part of that conversation. His eyes remained on hers, not demanding, not expecting, only offering. Amora glanced down at the card, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her presence still grounded in the same quiet strength that had defined her from the beginning. She did not reach for it right away. Instead, she let the moment settle, as if measuring not the opportunity, but the intention behind it. I already use what I know, she said, her voice steady, her tone gentle but firm. Every day. The words were not a rejection. They were a truth. William's lips curved slightly, not in disappointment, but in understanding, as if he had expected nothing less. He nodded once more, accepting the answer without trying to reshape it. Then I hope wherever you are, he said quietly, people learn to listen the first time. Amora held his gaze for a brief moment longer, then gave a small nod, acknowledging the sentiment without needing to expand it. She reached down then, not for the card, but for her order book, her roll calling her back, the rhythm of her work steady and unchanged. Your steak will be out shortly, she said, her tone returning to its professional cadence, but not losing the depth it now carried. William leaned back slightly, watching her as she turned, her steps measured, composed, moving seamlessly back into the flow of the restaurant as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet everything had. The card remained on the table, untouched, a quiet symbol of an offer that mattered less than the moment that had created it. And as the sounds of the restaurant rose again around him, William Carter sat there, not as the man who had entered expecting to be understood, but as someone who had finally learned what it meant to listen. The plate arrived with a quiet grace, set gently in front of William Carter as if nothing had changed, as if the evening had followed the same predictable rhythm from start to finish, yet the weight in the air told a different story. The steak rested perfectly centered, steam rising in thin, delicate curls, carrying the scent of butter and herbs that once would have been the focus of his attention. Now, it barely registered. William looked at it for a moment, then leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting across the room, not searching for distraction, but observing with a clarity that felt new, almost unfamiliar. Conversations continued, glasses lifted, soft laughter echoed from the far side of the dining room, but beneath it all, there was a quiet awareness, as if something unseen had settled into the space and remained there, even as life resumed. He picked up his knife and fork, the polished metal catching the light, but his movements were slower now, more deliberate, as though he were aware of each small action in a way he had not been before. He cut into the steak, paused, then set the utensils down again without taking a bite, his attention drifting back to where Amora moved through the room with steady, unhurried steps, balancing trays, exchanging brief words with guests, her presence consistent, composed, unchanged by everything that had just unfolded. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. The moment they had shared did not require acknowledgement to remain real. William exhaled slowly, his gaze following her for a second longer before returning to the table, where the card still rested untouched, a quiet reminder of an offer that now felt less important than the understanding that had replaced it. He reached for it, not to hand it off, but to look at it himself, turning it slightly between his fingers as if seeing it differently than when he had first placed it there. The name printed on it, his name, once carried a weight that opened doors, commanded attention, shaped outcomes before conversations even began. Now, it felt smaller, not in value, but in certainty. He placed it back down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table, a subtle act of order in a moment that had quietly redefined his perspective. Across the room, a young couple laughed over something small, their voices light, unguarded. At the bar, a man leaned in to listen more closely to the person beside him, nodding as if the details mattered. Near the entrance, a server paused to help an older woman adjust her chair, the gesture simple, unnoticed by most, but not by him. These moments had always existed, but they had never held his attention. Now they did. William picked up his fork again, this time taking a small bite, chewing slowly, tasting not just the food, but the stillness that had replaced the noise inside his mind. It was not discomfort. It was not regret. It was awareness. And it lingered. When Amora passed his table again, her steps just as measured, just as steady, he did not call out to her. He did not interrupt her work. He simply watched for a brief second, then gave a small nod, not expecting it to be returned, not needing it to be seen. It was not for acknowledgement. It was for himself. She continued on without pause, her focus on the next table, the next guest, the next moment that required her attention, exactly as she had said she would. William finished his meal slowly, each movement deliberate, each thought quieter than the last. When the check arrived, he glanced at it briefly, then placed his card down with a calm that carried none of the earlier assumptions. No impatience. No expectation. Just completion. As he stood to leave, the chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound, he took one last look at the room, not as something he owned or controlled, but as a place he had passed through and been changed by. The lights above cast a warm glow across the space, the same as when he had entered, yet everything felt different. Not because the room had changed, but because he had. He adjusted his jacket, straightened slightly, then walked toward the exit, his steps measured, unhurried, grounded in a way that did not need to be seen to be real. And behind him, the restaurant carried on, the quiet hum of life continuing as it always had, but for William Carter, the evening did not end at the door. It followed him, steady and undeniable, in the silence between his thoughts, in the spaces where he once assumed he already understood, and in the growing awareness that sometimes, the most important thing a person can learn is not how to speak, but how to listen, truly listen, the first time.